So I'm Dan Shaw with the Minnesota Board of Water and Soil Resources. I'm a senior ecologist with the agency and have been working with the Lawns and Legumes program since 2019 when we started the program. And John, just wanted to check, can you see my screen okay? Okay, great. And I want to thank all of you for joining today. You're all playing a really important role with this program. You'll be playing an important role with protecting the rusty patch bumblebee and other pollinators in the state through your projects, which will be helping to create a matrix of habitat within many areas of the state. So I'll be speaking, giving much of the presentation. You met John, and then Elena will be speaking near the end. The Lawns and Legumes program is led by the Minnesota Board of Water and Soil Resources, a state agency, but we're working very closely with the Blue Thumb Partnership and Metro Blooms on the individual support parts of the program. So they'll be working closely with all of you, helping to assist with the coaching, with the reporting of your projects, also helping to lead the workshops that are part of the Lawns and Legumes program. We'll be covering quite a bit of information today. We'll be focusing on how to get your projects installed, starting with assessing your project, developing a plan, the installation process, maintenance, and then reporting of your projects after you have them completed. We'll start right off with assessing your projects. With assessment of your landscape, we usually have people start with developing some type of graphic, either finding an aerial image online or doing a hand-drawn map of your landscape. And you can use that to do some of the initial planning. One of the key things to think about is how your yard is being used. Like, where are you using different areas of your yard? Do you have some lawn areas that you really don't use? If there's areas where you only walk on it to mow it, quite often that can be a good location for a planting because you're not using it for other purposes. It's good to record what trees and plants, other elements are within your landscapes. Also thinking about the drainage for your landscape. Where is the water running that comes off of your house or your driveway? And then thinking about areas of sun and shade for your landscape. Where are areas that are really sunny? Where are areas that have a lot of dense shade? Sometimes those can be a little more challenging to establish a planting in. So here's an example of a graphic that was printed off from an aerial image of a property where the house and the driveway is identified. You can see some other aspects of this landscape, the gravel driveway. There's some arrows drawn on this graphic showing the flow of water, and then some of the other trees and shrubs within this landscape. So this is all good information to record right at the beginning to think about where plantings could be located. Quite often we recommend expanding existing gardens to plant new plantings because you already have a start with those gardens, and sometimes you're just expanding an area of habitat within a landscape. But there can be many good locations for these gardens. Sometimes it's helpful to have them near the beginning or front of your landscape so that your neighbors can see the planting and see the insects that are showing up on your landscape. So we'll move on to additional planning topics. With the Lawns and Legumes program, we've been promoting 4 different project types: native pocket plantings, pollinator beneficial trees and shrubs, pollinator lawns, and pollinator meadows. It's been helpful to have different options within landscapes, and we have guidance on these different types of plantings. In some cases, there may be ordinances that may be somewhat restrictive on really large native plantings, and that's where sometimes it's better to have some options with some smaller plantings or maybe beneficial trees and shrubs within a landscape. We'll start off with a native pocket planting. These are small plantings. They can be around 10 by 10 feet or a little larger. This can be a really good starting point for people who are really new to gardening. We do have some templates that you can use as starting points for native pocket plantings. They can fit nicely within certain aspects of landscapes. You can see with this planting, it's fit up along the walkways, so that can be a good location. And you can always add to these plantings over time. So that's a nice aspect of these plantings. You can start small and then keep building onto them as you want to expand your plantings. And then with native trees and shrubs, there's many native trees and shrubs that provide high value for pollinators within landscapes. Many of them bloom early in the season before many of our prairie plants are flowering. So that can be a benefit for species that need early floral sources. Native cherries, hawthorns, serviceberries, chokeberries, basswoods, those are all good examples of native trees and shrubs that flower that can really add benefit within your landscape. Many of them might also have edible fruit, can produce shade, provide autumn color and winter interest as well. The third project type is a pollinator lawn. There's many different variations of pollinator lawns. There are pollinator lawn seed mixes that you can purchase. They usually contain fine fescue grasses in addition to species like self-heal, white clover, and creeping thyme have been pretty common species with pollinator lawns. So that would be a seed mix where you'd be starting from scratch, planting an area with that mix. There's also ways to incorporate flowers into existing lawns. We'll talk a bit about that later on, about methods to interseed into existing lawns. But you can also use containerized plants from species like violets within these landscapes to add more diversity and get native plants into a lawn setting. And then pollinator meadows is another project type. So this is the ambitious form of a pocket or a meadow garden or pocket planting. So these are larger plantings. Sometimes they're established just with containerized plants, but sometimes it's a combination of seed and containerized plants. Seed can be a little more challenging, and we'll talk more about that as far as using seed for these pollinator gardens. With containerized plants, it's easier to design with the plants and the layout of the plants. Seed is a little more unpredictable as far as how well it will establish. It takes a little more time and care for seeding. So if it's a very visible project like this one shown in the picture, quite often it's better to use containerized plants for this type of garden. In many cases, we promote using small plants. There's containers called plugs, which are pretty small plants. They're the least expensive to purchase. And as long as the plants are cared for, they can establish well over time within this type of a garden. We have a focus on native plants with this program, and there's a number of reasons for that. One is that our native insect species really need native plants within landscapes. We have around 450 different bee species within the state. They all have different needs. They've all evolved with native plants. And so the more diversity of native plants we can provide in landscapes, the more diversity of insects and other wildlife we can assist within the landscapes. We also see that with species like the monarch butterfly, that they rely on milkweeds within landscapes. They also really benefit from species like liatris within landscapes. And you can see a monarch in the upper right picture here where it's sitting on a liatris plant. Those are considered monarch magnets sometimes because they just draw in so many monarchs using the nectar from this plant. But then also bird species like the goldfinch benefit from the seeds that are produced by many of these native plants. And then one other note is that many of our prairie plants have very deep roots. And those deep roots help build soil health, the structure of soils. They also help with the infiltration of water over time. As those roots get deeper and deeper, they help draw water down into the ground. So when you're selecting your site and working on a graphic, you can definitely develop more detailed graphics, like this one is drawn in a computer program, but there's no need to do that necessarily. You can draw everything by hand, and that's much more accessible for most people. One important note is to take before pictures of your project before you get started, because we'll be looking for before and after pictures for the reimbursement part of your project. So be sure to take those before pictures. Next, we'll move on to selecting plant species for projects. There's several considerations with thinking about what plants will do best within your landscape. One is thinking about the areas of sun and shade, the moisture requirements of different species. It's good to look at your soils and see if they have a medium texture. Are they really sandy? Do you have areas that seem pretty moist? It may be a heavy soil like a clay that's holding moisture, or maybe an area you're looking at just gets more drainage within that area. So if you have sandy soil, then dry prairie plants quite often work well. A mesic or medium soil, there's seed mixes and plants for mesic soils or mesic prairie plants. And then there's plants that do well in moist areas too. Sometimes we call those wet meadow species. It's helpful to look whether those conditions are consistent throughout your whole site. And then thinking about some of your height requirements, what ideal height are you interested in for the planting is another consideration. And usually when we're planting these plants, we're spacing them about a foot apart, up to about 1.5 feet apart for most species. And sometimes that'll vary depending on the type of planting we're doing and how much mulch we might be using between plants. So once you know what plants you're interested in, if you know that you need plants for a medium soil, nurseries can be really helpful in helping you select plants for those conditions. We do have different resources on the Lawns of Legumes website that help guide plant selection. We have like lists for the rusty patch bumblebee and other types of plantings. I mentioned those templates that we have for plantings. So those can be really good resources just to help narrow down the list of species that you're looking at for your individual site. It's also helpful to make sure that you have plants that are blooming in the spring, summer, and fall to make sure there's flower resources through the whole season for insects. This is an example of one of the planting templates. This one was developed for rain gardens, but also for just sunny areas within your landscape. There's a wide range of different species here. Most of these species prefer what we would consider medium to moist soils for this template. We do have some other templates, one for shade, and the other one is more of a boulevard planting template. We are interested in creating more of these templates in the future because we're finding that residents working with the program really find these helpful to have a template they can bring to a nursery. And the nurseries may have other suggestions for your site, but at least it's a starting point for this discussion around plants that could be used for your planting. So when you're starting your project, we'll talk more about site preparation, but some other materials that you may need would be a mulch for your new garden. It's pretty common that wood mulch is used around the plants, at least initially for these plantings. You might want to incorporate other elements into your project, like stone or edging can help really define the border of your site. We can't reimburse for those materials with this program. Our reimbursements are really focused on the plants and the installation and maintenance of the plants for the garden. But those are other things that can be added just for aesthetics within a planting. We do have a reimbursable items list, so make sure you're paying attention to that reimbursement list as you're planning your project and thinking about materials for your project. With garden layout, there's definitely many ways it can be approached. Sometimes there's a matrix of grasses and sedges established within plantings, and then the flowers are grouped in amongst those grasses and sedges. That's becoming more and more common in stormwater plantings. The upper right picture here shows a planting that has groupings of different species, and that's usually the most common approach for these pollinator plantings, grouping different native plants together. Sometimes that's helpful for maintenance because you can identify where those groupings are. And then if you see some weeds in there, they're easier to find amongst those groupings. So that's become a pretty common approach to landscape design. There is actually some benefits for the insects too. There's some studies showing that it's a little more efficient for bees as they're foraging within gardens if the plants are in these larger groupings. This slide shows a planting layout. Again, you don't need to do something this fancy, but it's a good graphic to show how plants can be arranged within a garden. You can see that individual species are grouped together. Sometimes they're more in rows as they're up near the front of the garden. So it's creating an edge with different plants. Here, there's shorter species that are up in front. Usually that's a good approach because some of the shorter plants can get a little lost or outcompeted further back within a garden. So if you're planting things like prairie smoke or violets or something that's pretty short, it's good to have those up near the front. Passiflower would be another good example of a plant that doesn't compete very well when it has too much competition. And sometimes we get questions about non-native species too. We can't reimburse for non-native species with this program, but if you want to include non-native species within your garden, you're more than welcome to do that. If there's some plants that you really like that create a good border or just have a nice aesthetic appearance to them that would add to the character of your garden, you're more than welcome to include those plants as part of the planting. We get many questions about sources of plants for this program. We're focused on native plants, and so we encourage people to go to native plant nurseries to find plants for your plantings. There's one resource that's shown here that the Wild Ones group has put together. Wild Ones is a nonprofit that promotes native landscaping. So they have a resource that shows where different native plant nurseries are located within Minnesota and some adjoining states. Part of the reason for this is that they wanted to produce a list of nurseries that don't use pesticides as part of the production of their plants. So that was a priority of theirs, putting this resource together. There's also Blue Thumb partners. There's around 50 partners that are, I believe, that are part of Blue Thumb, and many of them do landscape work. So that can be a resource to look at for companies that can do some of the installation and maintenance if that's something that you need assistance with. There's also a DNR list of suppliers and landscapers, and that includes companies around the state that supply plants and do landscape services for these types of projects. And all these resources are linked at the Blue Thumb website. Next, we'll move on to the installation process, and we'll first start talking about site preparation, how to prepare your site. And we'll also get into some details about where you buy your plants and other materials and when will you plant. Things to keep in mind is that as you transition your project, like if you buy plants, those little plants are pretty susceptible. So you need to keep them watered and protected as you get ready to install them. They're coming from a nursery where they've been watered every day. So quite often they still need to be watered every day. And then once you get them in the ground, they're in a little better condition, but they still need water from time to time to make sure that they don't wilt. It's also helpful to think about these projects that you can stage them over time. You don't need to accomplish everything right at the beginning. You can start small, keep adding on to a planting over time. So not everything has to happen right away. But it is helpful to get a site installed once you've exposed the soil, because you can get a lot of weed growth within plantings if you have bare soil, and it just creates more work if you have too much weed establishment. So next we'll talk about installation for projects. We talked about keeping your plants healthy as you stage your project. Some native plant nurseries do deliver plants. So that's one thing to check into with native plant nurseries if you don't want to drive to go and pick up plants. Many of them are delivering plants through the mail now. That's something that's relatively new. There are some suppliers that have kits that work well with the Lawns to Legumes program. So it might have the plants and some fabric that'll suppress grass and edging. So those kits can be reimbursed also through this program. So that's something else to look for, are ready-made kits to make the process as easy as possible. There's also native plant sales in the spring. That's one other thing to look for within different areas of the state. That can be a good place also to get plant material. One key aspect when you're planning these projects and getting your material is to save your receipts. If they aren't itemized, take pictures of the plants next to, or take pictures of them that you can submit along with the receipt. And then, as we've discussed, in most cases, we can't reimburse for non-native plants. The only exceptions really are for those pollinator lawn plants, and those would be seed for the self-heal, white clover, and creeping thyme. So those are the only exceptions that we have for non-native plants. So everything else needs to be a native plant that you would be purchasing for the program. If you go into the reimbursement sheet for the program, it goes into more detail about plant materials that can be reimbursed for the program. When you're preparing your site, there's many different ways to go about doing the site preparation. The picture on the left shows a sod kicker. So there's a person that has a sod kicker, and you essentially kick it along and it cuts the sod out. There are mechanical sod cutters that are gas powered, and those can be rented quite often from hardware stores. So that can be one way to remove sod. You can do something similar just with shovels, like a flat shovel sometimes can work to remove sod. It just takes a little longer to remove sod from an area doing that, but that's another approach that can be done. There's also, it's pretty common to use cardboard to suppress lawn. That's becoming more common. It's best to find a cardboard that isn't glossy. That's just the kind of regular old cardboard that you can put down. Sometimes you can plant right into that cardboard right away if you dig out the sod that's underneath there and put your plants in. Other people like to leave it there for quite a while, let it kill the grass, and then come in and do planting. So there's different ways to approach that. Sometimes there's the lasagna method, where you can have the cardboard and compost and more cardboard. There's lots of YouTube videos on doing that type of approach. So there's a lot of good information out there on these different approaches to site preparation. The picture in the middle here shows a rain garden being dug. Rain gardens are a great addition to landscapes also. We don't reimburse for earth moving through this program, so that would not be a reimbursable cost. But if you do have an opportunity to dig a depression within a landscape to catch some excess water that might be running off your property and running into water resources downstream, that can really be a nice added benefit of a project. There's also many good resources about rain gardens on the Blue Thumb website and many others online. So I mentioned sheet mulching. That's using the cardboard is one method of site preparation. Solarization is another method where clear plastic is used, usually left down through a whole growing season, and the edges of that plastic need to be secured so that there isn't much airflow getting underneath the plastic. So that's a relatively new method that's being done. There, you could find YouTube videos on that also of how to do solarization. It just takes longer because you need to have that plastic down for quite a while. And you can move plants around in an existing garden to make space for new ones. So you may have some plants that you want to remove from a garden, or you're just making space within an existing garden for some of these native plants. There's a really good resource by the Xerxes Society for invertebrate conservation on organic site preparation methods, and that is linked on the Blue Thumb Grantee webpage. When you're getting ready to start planting, if you're using wood mulch, we actually recommend putting the wood mulch down first, which is sometimes counterintuitive, but it helps decrease the compaction of the soil as you're walking over that area if you have the wood chips down first. And then you pull the wood chips away and install the plants. It's helpful to lay the plants out, as you see in this middle picture, before planting, so that you can see the arrangement of the plants. You can put them in the groupings or whatever order you're interested in for that project, and then start installing them. The picture on the left is showing the plug containers up in the front there. You can see those are pretty small containers, usually about 1.5 inches in diameter. And then they might be a few inches deep for the root mass with those containers. There is one plant, it looks like what we would call a 2-inch container, that's on the right side of that picture. That's a little bit larger container and larger plant that is also available from native plant nurseries. If you do have water flowing down into the garden, it can be helpful to have rock at the bottom of a downspout just to break up that flow of water so it's not washing your mulch away. When planting trees, there are some helpful techniques for planting trees. Usually we recommend having the hole that the tree will be planted in about 2 times as wide as that root mass of the tree. It's also good to check and make sure there's not any circling roots. Sometimes plants grown in containers, the roots start circling, and it's good to either cut those circling roots or redirect them before planting. You want the base of your hole to be firm. You don't want soft soil there where it will sink over time. The planting depth of trees can be pretty important for them. You really don't want to get them too deep. And there's been lots of trees planted all over the state that have been planted too deep. Sometimes that causes the roots to start circling when trees are planted too deep. As you are planting a tree like this, you can brush the soil away from the roots that are near the surface. And you want those roots that are near the surface to be within about 1 inch of the surface when you're done planting. You don't want them buried too deep under the ground. And so you can see the flat top of this root mass. That may not actually be where the roots are. You want to brush that away a little bit, find those roots, and make sure you're getting those roots within about 1 inch of the surface as you backfill. And here in the picture they're backfilling. It's sometimes helpful to add water and backfill the soil simultaneously so that you're getting moisture in with that soil. And then it's helpful to lightly pack the soil around the tree once you're done. You don't want it really compacted because then there won't be much airflow or water getting down to the roots. So I'll talk a little bit about pollinator lawns. And pollinator lawns can be a a good economical way to establish pollinator habitat over larger areas, particularly if you're interseeding into an existing lawn. The first step is to mow lawn as short as possible. Rake the clippings to expose as much soil as possible. So here comes our mower. And then the raking. And then spreading the seed. Sometimes it's helpful to mix the seed in with compost. The compost can help provide some additional nutrients for the seed. It can also help suppress the existing grass a little bit. And then you want to keep the area moist until sprouting, and then cut back on watering and stop fertilizing. Once it starts to establish, you don't want to mow any lower than 3 inches ever again for the area, because you don't want to set back the native plants or the plants that you've been establishing within that area. One thing we found with these types of plantings is that if you have a sparse lawn to start with, these techniques can be more successful. If you have a very dense lawn, sometimes this can be very challenging to get seed to establish in those types of lawns. And so that can be more difficult to use this approach. It does tend to be more successful when you already have some gaps in your lawn and you can see some soil down through the grass. Oh, I missed the seeding and the plants establishing. Okay. With a pollinator meadow, so this is a little more challenging if you're using seed. We've talked a little bit about seed and that it's less predictable than using containerized plants. For seed, the main things are to have a prepared seed bed. You don't want any weeds growing in your area that you're going to be seeding. So that's an important consideration for preparing the area for seed establishment. If you use a sod cutter and you removed all the sod and you're down to bare soil, that can be a really good starting point for seeding. Or if you've done maybe a season of site preparation over an area, removing the existing vegetation, getting it ready for seed, that can be another good situation where you're ready for the seed to establish. It's really helpful to talk to the suppliers of the seed and make sure you understand the seed mix that you're using. They can provide a lot of really good guidance on how to install native seed. They can be a good resource for you. Usually for pollinator plantings, we install seed in the fall as our preferred time to seed, because many of the flowers that we're planting need a winter to break the dormancy of their seed. The freezing and thawing that happens over the winter breaks the seed coat and then allows the flowers to germinate in the spring. If we plant them in the spring, many of those plants won't germinate until the following spring. So that's why it's pretty common that we're seeding many of these pollinator plantings in the fall. Most plantings from seed will take around 3 years to establish. These native prairie plants spend a lot of time putting their roots down, getting their deep roots established, so they may not get very tall the first year and a half or so. So usually it is around 3 years before what we would consider a fully established planting from seed. It is pretty common to use seed and containerized plants, so that it can be an approach that can be used for some areas, particularly if you're doing a larger pollinator meadow and you really just want a good base of grasses like little blue stem and side oats, grama, some of those short prairie grasses. You could seed mostly the grasses and then use containerized plants for the flowers. That might be one approach. So you have a lot of options with these pollinator meadows. And then one other important part of the installation process is to take pictures once you're done. We mentioned the importance of taking before pictures of your project. So the next step is to take the after pictures after your project is installed. And then when you do your reimbursement process, you'd be submitting both the before picture and the after picture. And we realize that many of these plantings will look very new when you take your after picture. You'll have little plugs planted and wood mulch in many cases. So they're not going to look big and mature yet, but we do also encourage you to continue sending in pictures to us over time, because we, as a program, we really need those pictures to help promote the program. So we're always really interested in seeing how these projects look over time, and also hearing about the insects that are showing up. Then getting into maintenance, I'm just going to check on how we're doing with time here. It's about 12:40. So I think we're doing okay as far as timing. We may have a little bit of time at the end here for questions, additional questions. As we get into the maintenance of projects, it's important to think about watering. As I mentioned, these little plants that you're putting in the ground will need some care and water. It's important to water during dry periods, even after they're getting established. We usually talk about making sure that plantings get an inch of water per week, which could be through rainfall, but if there's not enough rainfall, then supplemental watering for those plantings. Sometimes you can put like a tuna can or something out in your garden, and that's a good way to track how much water is falling within your garden through the course of a week. It's good to get weeds before they get too big. That's especially true with some of the woody plants. The picture in the middle here is a tree that was pulled out of a native garden. They're a lot easier to pull when they're about 2 or 3 inches tall than when they get to that size. So it's good to keep up on those weeds before they get too big. Keep plantings clear of debris. That's particularly important for any rain gardens or where you might have a downspout coming into a garden. And then replacing mulch and plants as needed. As your plants get larger, you may not need much mulch. Sometimes the mulch is really most beneficial right away. And if you planted your plants about 1 foot apart, they'll really fill in and start competing with the weeds. The roots will tie up nutrients that the weeds need. You'll have shade from those plants, so you'll have much less need for weeding in the future. But sometimes mulch can just be an assurance, and maybe it's just needed on the edges where there's more sunlight coming in to suppress weeds. Memorial Day, July 4th, and Labor Day are good dates to keep in mind for maintenance. We recommend going out at least 3 times a year to do maintenance, and those can be good dates just as reminders to do some of the maintenance on projects. It's good to inspect for erosion and other trouble spots. And then in the spring, you can cut back plants to 18 inches in height. And we recommend doing that when dandelions start to bloom. If you do it sooner, it can impact some insects because we have many native bees that nest in the stems of native grasses and flowers. So it's best to wait in the spring, sometimes until around Mother's Day, to cut back those plants because those insects may be nesting in those hollow stems. So it's best to leave those in the fall and let them stand through the winter. Then our final section here is on submitting your reimbursements. With the Blue Thumb website, there's a web page for mapping your pollinator project. We have the web address here, and that's in things that we've been sending you as well for the Metro Bloom's websites. So make sure you have your digital copies of receipts, that you have your photos. So those are the main things that you need, your receipts and before and after pictures. Also know the size of your garden. It's good to estimate the size of the garden that you planted. We'll want that information because we're trying to keep track of how many square feet of pollinator habitat is established through this project, and keep track of the number of trees and shrubs that were planted. Also estimate the cost of your project. It's likely that you'll have extra time invested in your project. That's been very common for these plantings. And we'd like to know those numbers if you are putting extra what we consider match for these projects into the work and the costs. Keep track of that because it's helpful for us to know that. It's helpful as we talk to legislators and other groups that are helping to fund these kinds of programs, that we can show that there's a lot of investment going into the projects from people that are working on them. And it should take about 2 weeks from the time that you submit your request to the time that you get your reimbursement. So I'm going to turn it over to Elena pretty soon here, but I want to thank you for joining today and hearing this presentation. We covered a lot of information here. We do have many resources up on the program web pages, so keep referring back to those program web pages. And I just want to stress again the importance of the work that you're doing. You are playing a really important role for the protection of pollinators. Start small if you need to. Just find ways to get started once spring finally comes, and find your plants and just let us know, as we can provide assistance. But I just want to thank you again for attending today and for your work to support pollinators. And I'll turn it over to you now, Elena.